to introduce historian Jonathan Lammers, who's coming to us from Florida. And Jonathan gave a presentation that you might have seen at our 2018 History Night on the history of the 3rd Street Police Station. You can see that presentation on YouTube. It was terrific. It was both engaging and it showed the depth of research that Jonathan always makes. I was lucky enough to see another presentation of his on the history of tamale making in San Francisco. And that was one of the best historic presentations I've ever seen. And we have to talk him into doing that again and making it available. There will be a brief period for questions, I believe, after Jonathan's presentation. But if you'll wait to write those questions on chat when he comes to the end of his presentation. So with that, I give you historian Jonathan Lammers.
Hey everybody, great night. Really excited to be here. As Peter said, I'm talking to you from Tallahassee, Florida. Sorry, Florida did not contribute to today's vote totals. Me and my wife did our part. But I know it's been an exciting day for a lot of people, and I really appreciate all of you being here tonight. As Peter said, 2 years ago, I spoke for History Night. It was the most fun presentation I've ever had. And so I'm really excited to be back here with you. I'm just going to share my screen and go into I'm sorry, Peter, it says screen sharing is disabled for me. Could you enable me?
Where do I
enable?
Let's see.
I mean, while that's happening, Jonathan, we can say something really great about you. Since a couple of years ago, Jonathan, I apologize that I lost my voice, but this is Ricky Land. I am the project sponsor for the power station. And I had a fun day of losing my voice today, but Jonathan, over the past 2 years or 2.5 years, has really immersed himself in the history of Potrero Point, and has taken the opportunity that time has given him to understand not only the police station you guys heard so much about, but to learn about this portion of our neighborhood that really has this beautiful industrial history that is all too often forgotten. And Jonathan has done this incredible job of weaving the history of people, places, and purpose, mostly thinking about how people spent their time in the past and what they left us. And I'm so excited that he's giving us History Night tonight to talk about the history both of Potrero Point. He has served for us as the historian of the power station, and I'm so excited that he's serving this role. And he's given us the opportunity to learn from the past. So as we shape the future, Jonathan has given us an opportunity to think about how we can incorporate what's left into what's coming tomorrow. So Jonathan, I don't know if you can share your screen. I could say probably more wonderful things about you. Not a hard thing to say.
Not yet. Perhaps you can help walk Peter through that.
I'm making Jonathan. If I make you the host, will that work?
You got to make him a co-host or a co-panelist.
You're a host now, I think.
And then Peter, if you can do the same for me, then I will be able to do the same when it's my turn.
Yeah, I may. Oh,
there we go.
We're good.
Wonderful.
All right, just give me a moment here and we'll be. Let's see. Yes. All right. All right. I'm hoping everybody can see my screen okay. Yes? No, you're still seeing me?
Yep, doing great, Jonathan. Keep going.
All right, great. Thank you, Peter. So I'm just going to skip right into it. As Peter Enrique said, this is a really, really exciting project for me. I want to talk about the history of Potrero Point. Now, that's a name you may have heard, but it's not necessarily a place that you've seen. This is the earliest view we have of Potrero Point. This was done during the gold rush. And as you can see, it's a hill pointing out there into the bay. At that time, during the gold rush, Potrero Point was called the Potrero Nuevo, or the New Pasture. And it was owned by the sons of Francisco de Haro, who was the first alcalde of San Francisco. And that's his gravestone there in Mission Dolores. After the gold rush, forgive me, my screen is being a little bit weird for me. Not sure why it's blue screening out. This is a map made in 1857. It's a Coast Survey map. There's Potrero Point. I'm so very sorry.
Jonathan, don't worry about blue maps tonight. The world is seeing the world blue, so it's totally fine.
I just don't know why I did that.
You're incredibly fine. Keep going.
All right. Back to 1857. This is the Coast Survey map. And what was called then Point San Quentin, going to be called Potrero Point later on. I put the 3rd and 20th in there so you could appreciate that it really was a point. Also, you can see a lot of topographic lines there. Those are 20-foot. Each one of those represents 20 feet. So out there at Potrero Point, there was a hill on the north side, 100 feet tall. There was also a little tidal marsh there at the very point. If we put a modern overlay on it, you can see how much filling activity there's been in the bay. And I will talk about that more as we go along. And there's a modern day view of the site of 3rd and 20th. It doesn't exactly look like that point sticking out anymore. It's more like a big square. So the very first development at Potrero Point were black powder magazines by the DuPont company. And black powder was really important for mining. But if you were going to make black powder and store black powder, you wanted a place that was safe and far away. The rocky outcrops at Potrero Point were really handy because you could sort of dig caves in them for powder magazines, and you could also have a place where you could load them on ships where they could go out to the gold fields. So that's 1854, very quickly after the gold rush. And again, there's the powder magazines where they would be today, which is sort of in the middle of the power station redevelopment site. Now, a little bit away from Potrero Point was another development from 1857, and that is Tubbs Cordage. And Tubbs Cordage, if you could see it in 1857, if you were looking back from the south to the north across the point, you would have seen this big line out there in this treeless landscape. And that was what was called the rope walk. Because what Tubbs Cordage did is they made ropes, and they needed a big place to do it. And in developing San Francisco, there wasn't so much in the south of Market, so they moved out to Potrero Point. So here's an interior view of the building. And as I said, what they did is they made ropes, but they made of different sizes. We need rigging for ships. We need things for tow lines. We need tugs. We need all sorts of stuff. And so that's what they built. Excuse me. Here's some men with a particularly big tow line. And they were proud of their work here. They're showing the largest coil of rope ever manufactured in history.
16-inch, wow. Oh,
And this is from 1915, the Panama Pacific Exhibition, that World's Fair that was held in the Marina District. This was their display, which I think is quite pretty. So that's the rope walk, again, 1857. There's still an echo of it here today. If you look up, if we're looking at an aerial, we see like an odd line there. Again, there's the rope walk. There's an odd line in the buildings. These were built conforming to the old survey lines of for Tubbs Cordage, and that's still there in Dogpatch today. Another little remnant that's left, if you ever go to the Hyde Street Pier in the San Francisco National Historic Maritime Museum, they relocated the office out there. That's the Tubbs Cordage office. So if you wanted to get to Potrero Point, back in the day, the only real way to do it was to go down 3rd Street. And then from there, you would take a right on Brannan. You would head out along the edge of some tidal marshes, and then you would make a left over a bridge over Mission Creek, which is just about where the Bryant Street off-ramp is on the 101. And then you would follow another winding path all the way out there to Potrero Point. So it wasn't easy to get to. So in 1865, they decided to shorten the distance considerably and build what was called the Long Bridge. When the Long Bridge, at the time work began, many of San Francisco's principal industrial works were concentrated along or near the waterfront in the south of Market. But the noise and pollution did not make residents happy, and large manufacturing sites were scarce. So the result that once they built the Long Bridge, a number of important industries are going to begin relocating to Potrero Point. And here we can see some views of the Long Bridge. This is from Nob Hill in the 1870s. When you look at this picture, you see the bridge out there, that's 3rd Street today. Mission Bay is called Mission Bay because it was a bay. All the land to the right of that arrow is going to be filled in later on. That's the route of 3rd Street out to Potrero Point. In the middle of the bridge, they had a long wharf out there where some ships could pull up, sticking out. People like to fish off that. That's fishing for smelt in the 1880s off of the Long Bridge. Here's another view. We are looking south into Potrero Point. Again, this is a line of 3rd Street. If you look in the distance, do you see that big V notch there in the hills? That's how tall the hill is there. The road is sitting in a canyon. They're going to have to cut down all of that to clear it for industrial sites later on. So when you build a Long Bridge, this lovely bit of public utility, what are you going to do with the land along the bridge? You're going to sell it. So in November 1869, there is a big public auction where all the lands along the bridge are going to be sold so that they can be filled. And this map is showing like how the blocks are going to be laid out. And there at the top is Potrero Point. Now, I love this map. I actually only found it earlier this year. This is the fun part of working on a project over several years, is you keep finding new cool stuff. This map has got all kinds of goodies in it. At the bottom with the arrow, that's 3rd Street, and you can see that the Potrero and Bayview Railroad is running at it. Now, railroad doesn't mean steam engine, and it certainly doesn't mean a cable car. That just means that there are rails in the street so horses can pull cars along it. Now, over here, we've got Tubbs Rope Walk. Up here, we have got powder magazines, little wharves for the powder magazines. It says Gibbons Powder Magazine. Gibbon was actually a agent for DuPont. And then over here, we see these lines sticking out from the map. These are marine railways for launching ships. Now, I want you to imagine that you're back in, up here at the very top is the very first big industry that's going to relocate to Potrero Point, and that is Pacific Rolling Mills. And we'll talk about them more in a minute. But first, I want to imagine that you are sitting, you got off the Potrero and Bay Railroad, you got off the car, and you're sitting on the edge of a hill, and the year is 1870 or so, and you decide to snap a picture looking in that direction. And that's what you would see. You can see the marine railways where the boat builders have a means to launch their ships. You see that there is a very, very tall hill there with buildings on it. That's the nexus of a little neighborhood that's eventually going to be called Irish Hill. Irish Hill is the yellow arrow, and in the blue arrow, you see it's pointing to a building sticking out there. That's Potrero, that's the Pacific Rolling Mills. And if we looked at it from another angle, that's what we see. There's Pacific Rolling Mills, and there's the little nugget of Irish Hill. So Pacific Rolling Mills was in many ways the West's first great iron and steel foundry. It was founded in 1866. And the company completed work on its foundry at Potrero Point in 1868. They produced rolled steel, railroad rails, locomotive parts, axles, I-beams, rods, all kinds of steel products. And at their height, it employed nearly 1,000 men. And here we see some workers inside. So if you were looking at it on a modern map, that's where Pacific Rolling Mills was located. But now we're going to move on to the second big industrial work that comes to Potrero Point. Again, the reason it's attractive is we've got transportation on 3rd Street, and we're sort of away from the city, so we can have big, noxious, smelly, nasty, polluting uses, and nobody's going to complain. And there's nothing more noxious and smelly than a gasworks. And so this is the city gas company. This was not the first gasworks in San Francisco. This guy with the very, very steely eyes is Peter Donahue. And Peter Donahue comes out to San Francisco during the gold rush, and he and his brother James set up a tent in the south of Market, and they open a blacksmith shop, and it's very successful, and he's a completely savvy businessman. And in 1853, he's going to build a big network of shops, and he calls it the Union Iron Works, and it was located at Mission and 1st Street. In 1852, he decided that he was also going to incorporate a gas lighting company, the San Francisco Gas Company. At the time of the gold rush, the production of gas for lighting was really gaining acceptance in urban America. And it is, you know, I can't underestimate how big a change this is. It's a revolution in how people in cities experience the nighttime. Originally, gaslight is going to be used for street lighting, but it's also going to be adopted by industrial employers because it means you can run your factory with an around-the-clock shift. So the company built a gasworks located at Howard and Fremont Street, which is right next to the Union Ironworks. Later on at Steamboat Point, they built another gasworks. And you can look out and see the 3rd Street Bridge and know that this is probably about 1870 or 1880. He's got another big gasworks. In 1860, Peter Donahue, he is such a capitalist, he founds the Omnibus Railroad Company, which uses the Union Hall on Howard Street as its car barn. And he has a near monopoly on gas from the 1850s until 1870, when a new competitor appears, and that is the City Gas Company. They immediately began work on construction of a new coal gasification plant at Potrero Point. And the engineer who helped build it had previously built the Pacific Rolling Mills facility. And to level the hill for the gas company site, some 90,000 cubic yards of rock are excavated. And here's some early views of this gas site. There was a bunch of big brick masonry structures, including a 280-foot by 120 coal shed, a big retort house, a big boiler room, a purifier house. Prior to the development of natural gas reserves, gas had to be manufactured. So what they did is they would use coal and they would heat it up in a retort or an oven, and this would release gas or coal gas, which was then cooled and they'd condensed, and then they'd take it to a purifying house where it went through sieves of lime. Basically, they were trying to get something with a nice high concentration of hydrogen that they could use for lighting. This opened in 1872, the Potrero Gas Works of the City Gas Company. But Peter Donahue, who had started off, did not like the competition, and in 1873, he buys them out. And this merger is going to create the new San Francisco Gaslight Company, which is the start of one of the United States' great utility monopolies. So we've got Pacific Rolling Mills, City Gas Company. Who's going to be next? It's the Western Sugar Refinery. Western Sugar Refinery was started by Klaus Spreckels. Earlier, he had built a sugar refinery in the south of Market in 1867. And to expand his operations, he moved it out to a new refinery in 1881 at Potrero Point. Spreckels was sort of emblematic of imperial San Francisco, and by that I mean that he was able to project the city's capital on a world stage. During the 1870s, Spreckels had acquired land and water rights on the Hawaiian island of Maui, where he incorporated the Hawaiian Commercial and Sugar Company. He then hired Herman Schuessler, who was the chief engineer of the Spring Valley Water Company, to design a big, massive irrigation system They would include 65 miles of canals to bring water from the wet side of the island to the dry side. He's also going to develop a little, a company town called Sprecklesville. And when Sprecklesville is complete and the irrigation canals are complete, it becomes the largest sugar plantation in the world. Labor for growing the sugar cane was supplied under the contract labor system. And that's when Spreckles advanced funds to transport Japanese, Portuguese, Filipino, and other immigrants to Hawaii, where they would be contracted to work for a specific amount of time. This is actually a painting of Japanese workers on the Spreckles Hawaiian plantation. Many of these laborers are later going to migrate to San Francisco after the labor contract is up. And this is going to be a key factor in the development of a Filipino community in San Francisco. And it's also going to feed into the development of a Japanese enclave in South Park. And of course, they're going to travel from Hawaii back to San Francisco on ships also owned by the Spreckles Company. The sugarcane, once it was harvested in Hawaii, it was processed in mills and brought to sort of a raw form. If you know turbinado sugar, which I love, they would get it to that form, and then they would take it down these marine railways, and they would load it on ships, and they would take it back to San Francisco. And they would offload these big sacks of, again, essentially turbinado sugar, and they would take it through conveyors up into Spreckles Sugar Refinery. And their guys in what was called the cutting room would cut the bags open, and they would dump all that sugar through grates on the floor. And then it's going to go down, and it's going to go through various processing. It's going to be boiled. Then it's going to go through charcoal. It's going to go through a whole series of stuff to take out all the quote unquote impurities. Here's another one. This is where it's being filtered, and we're getting the brown out of it and making it making it white. Then it could be packaged. It would go to an assembly line where it would be marketed as Sea Island sugar. The Western Sugar Refinery it relied exclusively on white labor, primarily German, Slovenian, Irish, Swedish, Danish immigrants, employed about 500 people. And throughout the decades, Spreckles patented new methods of making sugar. The cube sugar, crushed sugar, powdered sugar, fine crushed sugar, dry granulated sugar. Those are all innovations that comes out of Spreckles, because at this time, he and one other company controlled 95% of America's sugar production. So right now, this is what we've got at Potrero Point: Rolling Mills Gas Company, the sugar refinery in 1881. In 1883, we're going to add two new huge ones, the Union Iron Works and the California Barrel Company. Now, Peter Donahue, who had founded the Union Iron Works and bought out the gas company, sold it in 1864 to George Prescott and Irving Smith. The funds from that allowed Donahue to concentrate on his gas business and also to complete the San Francisco-San Jose Railroad, of which he was one of three primary investors. As with Spreckles' move out of Soma to Potrero Point, Prescott moved the Union Iron Works out of Soma to Potrero Point in 1883. If you look at far right of this photo, not where the arrow is, but far right, that would be the present day intersection of Michigan and 20th Street. Where the arrow is a railroad siding. The reason I wanted to call that out is the filling activities are ongoing in the area. And if you look at this next view, that's the same site. They filled all the bay where the railroad came through. Now, Irving Scott was a very capable leader of the Union Iron Works. You know, before they had built agricultural stuff, railroad, mining equipment, but now they're focusing on shipbuilding. And soon it was one of the finest shipbuilding facilities in the United States. They built most of the ships. They became the Great White Fleet. And today, the collection of historic buildings left over from the Union Iron Works is known as Pier 70. The other company that came in, the California Barrel Company, their name is just as you would think it is. There's a big use for storing stuff, you know, California's agricultural output. So they made barrels for cider, pork, olives, oil, lard, fish, milk, sugar, grapes, pickles, butter, you know, whatever you can think of, they were making it. And they too had relocated from the south of Market out to Potrero Point. Now, Peter Donahue died in 1885, and the guy who's going to take over the San Francisco Gas Light Company, which had bought the works at Potrero Point, is this guy. He's Joseph B. Crockett, and he's an engineer. Until the mid 1880s, the Potrero Gas Works had produced coal gas, but he brought in some new methods. One's called water gas, where when you're heating the coal, you blow it through with steam, and in the chemical reaction, the coal draws off the oxygen from the steam while freeing the hydrogen molecules, and it makes an even more potent hydrogen gas called syngas. Now, Crockett also was expanding the San Francisco Gaslight Company. In 1895, he builds a new gas works out at the edge of what is today the Marina District. If you look at that beyond the arrow, that little bay there, that is actually going to be filled in, and that's the site of the 1915 World's Fair and later the Marina District. So the gas works was over near Bay and Fillmore, and there's actually a little present day echo of that as well. Do you see this building over here on the left-hand side? That's the office of the San Francisco Gaslight Company, and it's still there today. In fact, it is San Francisco landmark number 85. Well, gas is not the only game in San Francisco by this point. Electric lighting is fast gaining acceptance. The pioneer electric plant on the West Coast was built in 1879 by the California Electric Light Company. And this was kind of an amazing plant because they set up just to sell their light to consumers. You know, before that, power plants, electric plants had often been built specifically to serve, like, say, one industrial building. Very quickly after they built their first plant, which is basically where the flood building is, where the Gap used to be, where the cable car turnaround is at Powell and Market, they built a new plant nearby on Jesse Street in 1881. And today, this building, much remodeled, is the Contemporary Jewish Museum. They also built another plant called Station B in 1878 at 178 Townsend Street, and that building is also still there. So during this period, electric generation was in its infancy, but it really promised enormous financial returns to any company that's capable of securing control of the market. And a lot of competitors entered the field, but there was nobody bigger than Thomas Edison. And in 1891, Edison Light and Power buys the California Electric Company, and they become the city's dominant electric supplier. Well, in response to that, the city's now got two utility giants. In gas, it's the San Francisco Gaslight Company, and then you've got Edison Power and Light. But in 1895, the Gaslight Company said, you know what, we're going to build our own electric plant to compete with Edison. And the two firms talked it over, and in 1896, they agreed to merge and create the San Francisco Gas and Electric Company, which is the direct antecedent of today's Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Also around this time, the company directors decided that electricity would be marketed primarily as a source for lighting, while gas would be marketed for cooking and heating. So remember Joseph B. Crockett, the engineer. Now he is president of the San Francisco Gas and Electric Company. He was also apparently somewhat arrogant. And in 1899, he got into a dispute with Klaus Spreckels at the Pacific Union Club. Spreckels was objected to the emissions from the plant on Jesse Street, what's today the Contemporary Jewish Museum, because it's blackening the walls of his new, spanking new white skyscraper that he's built at the corner of Market and Third, which is the home of the San Francisco Call newspaper. So when he complained, Crockett apparently laughed at Spreckels, and Spreckels is like, okay, if you're laughing at me, you're going to get a new competitor. And so Spreckels decides to build his own power plant. And by 1900, work was underway on Spreckels' new station, which is built right next to his sugar refinery out there at Potrero Point. And he's going to call it the Central Station because it's going to become the largest and most important electrical plant in the city. Spreckels also decided to compete in the production of gas light, and he's also going to build a new manufactured gas plant next to his sugar refinery as well. So if this is how it is before he decides to go in the electric business, he's going to reconfigure the lands down at the bottom. He's going to buy out the California Barrel Company so they can move, and he's going to build the Central Station He's going to keep the sugar refinery, and he's going to build the gas works. So he builds the plant, the central station. It was mammoth by the standards of its day. It had two principal halls standing side by side. There was a turbine hall, or an engine room, as it was called originally, and a boiler hall. And combined, they measured 430 feet long, 140 feet wide, and 80 feet tall. The halls were connected internally, and they each had a steel truss roof with galvanized iron. So in doing my research, I think it's helpful to understand Station A a little bit if you understand how a electrical plant works. You boil water, and you take that water and you send it through pipes to an engine. And in that engine, the steam under pressure in a chamber makes a piston move. They use triple expansion engines, so the hottest steam would move the piston in the first one, then less hot steam would go to the next one. It's engineered for that. And then even cooler steam would go to that final one. And those would all turn a drive shaft with a wheel surrounded by copper coils to make power. So as I said, you've got two halls side by side. The one that's closest to you in this image is the engine room. And those are those triple expansion steam engines I told you about. You can see the big wheels. And that's what it looked like shortly after being built. There's another closer look at the engines. Those engines today, a big home generator like you'd use after a hurricane, as we do in Florida, I could buy something at Home Depot, which would have almost the same capacity as one of those. And this is the boiler room where the steam is being made. Basically, this is just a giant boiling kettle, and this is the boiler hall. So Spreckles gets the central station rolling pretty heavily. 1902, he's powering the new San Francisco-San Jose Railway, which he owns with electric power. He's also sending electric power to Pacific Rolling Mills, his neighbor, and he gets into a price war with the San Francisco Gas and Electric Company. And so in 1903, he agrees to sell. And the sale was reputedly for $6 million, most of which Spreckles is going to take in bonds in a new company, Pacific Gas and Electric. So now Pacific PG&E's holdings at Potrero Point include the old gas plant up at the top. They've got, and also Spreckles' new electrical plant and his new manufactured gas facility. So in 1910, gas coming out of the gas works at Potrero Point is being distributed throughout San Francisco. And then electricity, primarily coming out of Potrero Point, is also powering the city. To send the power out, they have to send it to substations where the high voltage is taken down. And a lot of these buildings are actually still around and still scattered through San Francisco neighborhoods. These are the substations. Why don't you take a look at that one at upper left. That is substation E, located at the corner of Mariposa and Vermont in Potrero Hill, except you know it as this building. So there were problems at the new plant, and one of them was that it required enormous volumes of water. And the original water system they had to bring in water from San Francisco Bay, when the tides were low, they couldn't get it. Why do you need to bring in water from San Francisco Bay? Well, you're using city water, you're using fresh water that you're boiling to make the steam, but then you need to cool the steam down and condense it so you can boil it again. And the easiest way to do that is to bring in a huge amount of cool seawater from San Francisco Bay. So this is a map in 1905, and you can see that they've got a whole channel coming into the site. In 1911, they decided to rebuild it with these giant 60-inch pipes. And you can see they're made of redwood, you know, essentially bands of redwood all stuck together because they swell together when they're wet. And this is looking west towards Potrero Hill. You can see the sugar refinery on the right. In this view, you can see Spreckles' new gas plant there, and there's also a gas holder. Gas holders are what you use to store the gas. Once you've manufactured it, you got to have a place to put it. And also, as people are using that gas, you want to maintain steady pressure. So that's what a gas holder does for them. They're also going to, excuse me, upgrade the plant's electrical generating capacity. And that includes this newfangled thing called the turbine generator. Turbine generator, instead of using a rod and piston, it uses like fan blades, and the steam is blown across it. It blows the fans turn the shaft, and you make the electricity. This was just a more efficient way to make electricity. So they got their first new steam turbine in 1912, which was 15,000 kilowatts. This was about 10 times more powerful than the first engines. But in a few years, almost the entire plant is going to be turbines. In this view, you've got an old engine sitting there in the foreground, and as you move down the line, you're seeing all new steam turbines. They like that picture so much they put it on the cover of the PG&E Company magazine in 1920. Around the same time, they also redo the boilers. They want to make the boilers more efficient, make that steam easily using less fuel. And once they do new boilers, they need to do new vent stacks. So we go from an appearance of Station A, say around 1915 there at the left, you can see the boiler stacks, the 6 of them over there. Well, when you put the new boilers in 1920, the setup looks more like this. So now we are really at the point where Potrero Point is humming. We've got the Union Ironworks, which is going to be acquired by Bethlehem Steel around the turn of the century, and it's going to become the Bethlehem shipyards, storage shipyards during the wars. In this photo, you can see the sugar refinery are the buildings at right, Station A at the left, and a big gas holder at very far left. Here's another view. Looking at it, as you can see, it's there's a lot of landfilling left to be done south of the site. In 1929, they build the biggest gas holder that they are ever going to build, or 28 and 29 at Potrero Point. And they published this image to show it in comparison to the St. Francis Hotel at Union Square. When they build it, it's going to sort of destroy the last remnant of Irish Hill. If you remember from the beginning of the talk, Irish Hill was sort of a community that came up early. It had a lot of lodging houses. It had saloons. It's where workers who worked in the nearby plants, a lot of them lived up there. And over the years, it kept getting chipped away and chipped away. And so you see in this image that, some of the buildings on the hill essentially have, a 60-foot drop off right outside their door because of the expansion of the industrial facilities. So when they build this giant gas holder, they need to excavate. And the round circle at the bottom, you can see that is going to be the foundation of this giant 10 million cubic foot gas holder. But I want to focus at the top because right there, Irish Hill is graded away and becomes right there. What's fascinating to me is, do you see this little hill here? They decided that, well, we don't need to we don't need to chip away any more of that rock, and it has just stayed there all this time, and it's still there. Here's another view of the exact same thing, so you can get an idea of the scale of the land transformation that goes on. This is right near 3rd and 20th, and you were looking southeast, sort of, down, and you can see Irish Hill, the buildings up here at this point, and you can see this big drop off that I talked about. So this hill is in the way of expanding this business. This is the American Can Company, and it's doing well, and it wants to expand, so it's going to take this chunk of the hill. So this is the exact same viewpoint a few years later, after American Can has leveled the hill and built their huge factory there on 3rd Street. This is right near 3rd and 20th. Another view to look at it, Irish Hill in the distance at upper right, up here. Here's another hill at Potrero Point. This is a view today. Irish Hill's gone, this one's still there. So in 1930, PG&E decides it's going to remodel Station A. They're going to make it look nice on the outside, and they're going to thoroughly modernize it on the inside. In tandem with what they're doing, they're also going to convert the plant from fuel oil to natural gas. And that's because in the late 20s, there was a big oil field find south of Bakersfield called the Kettleman Oil Fields. They had a huge amount of natural gas that was associated with the oil. Initially, they just burned it off, but then, you know, somebody smacked their forehead and said, perhaps we can put this in a pipeline and send it to Los Angeles and San Francisco. And that's what they did. And at the time, that was the world's biggest natural gas pipeline. So they're renovating the plant, as I said, inside and out. And what they're going to do is they're going to regularize the facade. Before you had gable roofs, now they're going to make it a nice flat roof design. We're going to make this look like a nice, prim, and proper industrial building. This huge thing over here is part of the sugar refinery. They're going to build a new switch. This is a new switch house here for switching the electricity. Down here, this big opening, there's a railroad siding that runs along here where these cars are. And that's so if you need to bring in equipment, you can put it on a railroad car and run it right through the switch house and into the boiler hall or to the turbine hall. Here's another view, the little building that Peter talked about earlier, the gatehouse that he has the idea to make a cafe if it can be moved, if you have a site. That's this building right here. This controlled access to the site, not just to the PG&E facilities, but also to the sugar refinery. Workers would come down and come in through this gate each day. They completely retooled the inside of Station A in 1930, and they put in 2 huge new generating units called Unit 1 and Unit 2. Get an idea of the scale. Here's some workers on those. These are, again, just big steam turbine engines. And they are, just those 2 are far more powerful than all of the other engines that had ever sat in that room combined. Now, Station A, the engine room, it's multi-level. So if you go from the steam turbines over here, you also see this level. There's catwalks and you could go downstairs, and now here's the engines up here, and you can see there's this whole other set of equipment where you're bringing over the steam to do the turbines. And again, catwalks, so workers can get around to maintain the stuff. This is the boiler room. They put in brand new boilers. I love seeing this. You just get an idea of the heroic scale of the architecture. And so that brings us into the 1930s. And this is sort of like the height of Potrero Point. I love this view because it's a postcard view. And we know it's after 1936 because the Bay Bridge is in place, or 1935. But there's something missing in this. They sort of cut off the rest of Potrero Point. In fact, it looked more like this at that time. And there's still ongoing land clearing activities. We talked earlier about how this gas holder took out the remnants of Irish Hill. Well, I want you to focus on this big hill sitting here. There's another view of it. You can see I just scraped the building right in there. Well, today there's no hill there. It's completely gone. And the reason that it got demolished is for World War II, when the Bethlehem shipyards were part of the arsenal of democracy. And here we can see how many ships are all pulled up in there during the wartime. At that point, Potrero Point is absolutely humming. These are defense industry workers, not just from the shipyards, probably from American Can as well, coming to some sort of patriotic, maybe this is a bond drive or something of that sort. This is, again, all in what today you'd call Pier 70. After the war, there's going to be some really big changes, dramatic changes at Potrero Point. The Western Sugar Refinery that Klaus Spreckels had built back in 1881 decides to sell, and they sell out to C&H Sugar, which, if you ever wondered what C&H stands for, that's California and Hawaiian. But as soon as C&H gets it, they decide, you know what, this factory is pretty beat, and they decide it's not worth spending the money to modernize the plant. They're going to stick with what they have over there in Crockett. So they sell that land to PG&E, so PG&E can start expanding its steam operations. And what they do is they basically demolish all of the old sugar refinery except for the 10-story building and 2 reinforced concrete sugar warehouses, which had been built in the 1920s. These warehouses are actually still there, and they're the only part that's left of the original sugar refinery. So in 1965, they decide to build a new plant at the site, Unit 3. That arrow at upper right is where Unit 3 is going to go, on the site right next to the bay. It is also another big steam turbine. It is more powerful. not only more powerful than what's at Station A, but it is far more efficient as well. It's just cheaper to operate. But Unit 3 was designed to operate on either natural gas or fuel oil. But to supply that fuel oil, they needed to make some modern fuel oil tanks. So they demolished the old San Francisco gas works that had been built all the way back in city gas back in 1872. They finally demolish it. And you'll forgive me, I should have mentioned this earlier. When those natural gas supplies came in 1930, there wasn't a need for manufactured gas anymore. So they had just put the plant on standby. So from 1930 and still till the mid 1960s, the old gas plant had just sat there, and then they finally demolish it so they can build these fuel oil tanks, which are going to be able to supply Unit 3 over here. One of these tanks actually is supplying what are called peaker units. They're these little things here. At times of peak demand, when electricity is really needed, these would fire up, and they use sort of jet fuel, and one of these tanks is used to supply just the peaker units. So Station A was last run in 1979, and the catalyst for its closure was an accident where an enormous piece of equipment broke loose. And rather than repair it, they said, this thing is just aging. It was built in 1900, and they're going to decide to shut it down and let Unit 3 take everything. So it runs for the last time in 1979, and they got the buildings. The boiler hall, as you might imagine, and this is the boiler hall in this image, all that equipment had been insulated with asbestos materials. They've got asbestos everywhere, and they have to maintain it. They can't just walk away. Even though the plant's closed down, they still have to maintain that stuff. And they decide after a couple of years that having workers go in to make sure that the asbestos is not breaking up is just not worth it. So they begin to dismantle the boiler hall. They're just going to demolish it. It's cheaper than trying to just take out the asbestos a little bit at a time. When they get done, they leave only one piece of the boiler hall. They leave the gate or the doors to it. So this is the gate to the boiler hall, and maybe some of you have seen this. This is all that's left. The rest of the boiler hall is completely gone. And they also, because it wasn't full of asbestos, they left that little gatehouse. Again, that's the little building that Peter was talking about. And here we see the sugar refinery building, and we can see the stack for Unit 3. The sugar house is actually the sugar refinery building is gonna hold on until 1995. It was damaged after Loma Prieta and PG&E. They'd been using it as document storage. They didn't care about the building too much. And so in 1995, they demolish it. Also around this time, taggers start breaking in to the interior of Station A. In 1999, PG&E sells it to the Southern Company, which is pretty soon spun off into Morant. And I'm sure a lot of you Potrero residents know about Morant. Morant planned to demolish all the old buildings so they could construct a new power plant. And as part of these efforts, Morant decided to also abate any asbestos materials at the site. And this included the asbestos cement roofing, which had been installed on the southern portion of the turbine hall, as well as on another building there called the meter house. So that's why the roof was opened up. It was to get rid of asbestos roofing. Now, Morant said they wanted to build a new plant on the site once they demolished Station A. But there were a lot of protests about this because people who lived in Bayview Hunters Point had some of the highest asthma rates in the city, and San Francisco officials urged the California Energy Commission not to approve it, or at least to make it conditional on shutting down the Hunters Point power station. Eventually, some new high power transmission lines came to San Francisco, and this allowed for the closure of the Hunters Point plant in 2006. And then focus shifted to Unit 3 at Potrero Point, which was described as a symbol of environmental racism. And in 2009, the city of San Francisco, Morant jointly agreed to shut it down. And Unit 3 was permanently shut down in January 2011. So we go from the site in the 1930s to what we saw in the 1910s, and this makes way in 2016. This site was sold for redevelopment, which brings us to the now. So thank you all for sitting through that. I'm going to stop my sharing now, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Enrique Landa, who is the the lead person on the redevelopment of the power station site, and he's going to talk about the future of Station A and Unit 3.
Well, Jonathan, let's stop for a split second. The word is custodian. So I apologize. I've lost my voice. I was yelling a little bit today. I was a little bit excited about the news of the day. But Jonathan, let's talk a little bit about the work we've done together on the history side. And let's talk about what you've done just before I start my presentation on Station A, the work we've done together over the past 24 months to get the history of Station A sorted together and what you've done. I think that'd be really neat to tell people. Oh, you're on mute, Jonathan.
I didn't want to interrupt you talking, Enrique.
No problem.
I realized, first of all, Enrique, I said I would take some questions in the chat, and I completely forgot that as I handed it off to you. But before we get to that, and if you do have questions, go ahead and throw some up on chat. Enrique and I met, I was working at the San Francisco Planning Department,
Yep.
and I was working on the landmark program, and Enrique had just taken a long-term lease on the Swedish American Hall, and he was interested in the history of the building and was a big proponent of having it turned into a San Francisco landmark. So I did that, and it is now a landmark. And then right at that point, I had to move back to, I didn't have to, my daughter was approaching school age, and the San Francisco real estate market was as crazy as ever. So I decided to move back to be near my folks in Florida. And a couple months in, Enrique got in touch with me, and he said, hey, I just bought a power plant site in San Francisco, and there's a lot of history on it. Can you help me out? And for the last 4 years, I've worked on various aspects of the site. I learn more every month. And this presentation, I really did just finish it up right before tonight. Sort of adds in several things that only in the last few months I've really become more conversant with. So it's been a joy for me to do this.
Jonathan, it's been awesome. Well, it's been great to learn about this part of this city with us. And you know, what's neat about the power station, and it's been a lot. I'm Enrique Linda. I am, apart from having lost my voice today from being a little bit excited about today's news, I am the project sponsor of the Potrero Power Station, which is the redevelopment of this site. And my job over the past 4 years has been to reimagine and reintegrate this part of the city into our neighborhood and largely into Potrero Hill. Peter, you're gonna have to let me find a way to share my screen, and I don't know how I can do that. Either you or Jonathan can do that as a host. One of you host, and I just need to be able to share my screen if you guys can.
Jonathan, I think you are host now, so maybe
Forgive me.
so maybe you can make Enrique host. I'm not quite sure.
Yep.
Awesome. Well,
Sorry, Enrique.
And also, Jonathan, can you, when Enrique starts his presentation, can you turn off the recording?
I can do that. I can do that here.
Enrique can do that.
Yeah, I can do that. So, you know, I'll start a little bit about where we started. So my name is Enrique Landa. I'm a partner at Associate Capital. My firm bought the power station in September 2016. And when we started, we got, you know, it's very fun when somebody throws you the keys to a power plant and says, here you go, and starts you off on the concept of reimagining the future. And part of what Jonathan was talking about was a little bit about our approach, which was to really begin and understand what was the history of the project and how we would begin to understand what came before us and what came as a part of this rich history of San Francisco early history. You know, one of my favorite parts of the story that Jonathan really didn't touch on, but it's true, it's San Francisco land use law. One of the earliest parts of it came at Potrero Point, which was that the DuPont Nemours Company in, I think it was 1856, and Jonathan will correct me, but I love that the historians here to do so, decided to get moved from Sutter and Kearney where they were producing dynamite, and they decided to move to Potrero Point because it was too dangerous to produce dynamite in the middle of financial district, and so they moved it out to Potrero Point. And so over that 100-year history of industrialization, the power station really served as the engine to San Francisco history. And it served as the engine of San Francisco industrial history. And when we took over, we had two power plants. One was Unit 3, which is the 1960s power station along the water. We see a rich future for that power station. But the other was Station A. And Station A, as Jonathan mentioned, we got partially demolished. And it's not easy to get an unreinforced masonry building that has been 50% demolished. And so as a result, we had a ruin. And this ruin is quite beautiful. On the western side, the Station A is this very beautiful brick building. But on this eastern side, it's this decaying interior wall that has this very beautiful image. And so when we took this over, there was this very beautiful decaying building. Everybody wanted to save and nobody knew what to do with it. And it was quite challenging because the building's not small. Station A, or what's left of it, is 100 feet wide, 400 feet long, 65 feet tall. It's missing its roof, and the majority of the building's been demolished. And so to make it a part of the project, we really struggled to see what could be done with it. And one of the things we did as part of the entitlement process, and one of the things that was great, is that Peter was such a resource during this part, was that the Potrero Hill Archives Project really gave us the impetus and said, look, you got to push yourselves harder. You got to find a way to save this and make this a part of your project. And so we did, and we pushed quite hard. And eventually the building became part of our project, and now it's become part of our first phase. And we were able to attract and bring one of the world's best architects to work on the project. I'm about to play a presentation from Herzog and de Meuron. Herzog and de Meuron is the architect of the de Young, and they've done actually a couple of power stations around the world. They've done the Tate Modern. They've done the Caixa Forum in Madrid, was actually the redoing of an old power plant in the middle of central Madrid that served its rail line. And they've found a way to rework these old buildings and give them new life. And so we're incredibly excited that we are able to bring new life to Station A. I'm now going to play a recording of a video from that I recorded yesterday with Jason Franson of Herzog and de Meuron. He's the architect in charge of reimagining Station A. Unfortunately, he lives in Basel, so although he's an American, he was not available tonight late, but I did tape it. So I will play the overview of the project. And then after I do that, we will take your questions and be able to show you a little bit about what we're trying to do with the building. So I'm going to start over here, and I will play it now.
Can you, Enrique, if you can hear me, I think you're host now. Do you see anybody by any chance waiting in the waiting room? I hear that there may be people there, but I can't see them, not being the host at the moment.
Let me see. I just admitted a whole bunch of people right before I started speaking. Let me see if there's anyone left. Everyone seems to be admitted. And by the way, it's awesome that on a night like tonight, we have 72 people watching History Night. So I think that's awesome. So that is wonderful. I hear that. Peter, thank you for your leadership. I love it. So I'm going to now